So, ladies and gentlemen, President Trump has been warning everyone about the communist takeover happening inside the Democratic Party for quite some time now. Now, it's being marketed as democratic socialism, right? That's what they want to call it. But when you understand branding, you understand that's why they're labeling it as such. Now, the new face of the Democratic Party and this socialist movement is Zoran Mamdani, who recently froze the rent on New York City's rent-stabilized apartments. And so now the owners of these buildings are fighting back and suing Mamdani because they believe he rigged the rent guidelines board, ladies and gentlemen, by stacking it with individuals who were loyal to him and only him, rather than people who would objectively follow the law, examine the data, and consider the real cost of operating these buildings. As a result, the board voted to freeze the rent. However, the property owners are still responsible for all of the costs associated with owning and operating and maintaining an apartment building in New York City, including property taxes that continue to increase because of the city. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we got a lot to get into. Don't forget, if you enjoyed the content, you can let me know by smashing that thumbs up, subscribe to stay locked in with future videos, and shout out to everybody who comments down below and watches to the end. Let's go ahead and get it and start right here. So let's get into this first clip right here. We got New York City landlords just sued Mayor Mamdani over rigged rent freeze. A coalition of landlords is taking Mayor Mamdani to court after the city imposed a 2-year rent freeze on nearly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments. Check this out.
Looking to overturn the city's newly approved 2-year rent freeze on roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments. They argue that Mayor Zoran Mamdani improperly influenced the Rent Guidelines Board to deliver on a campaign promise. Let's bring in now Randy Mastro, attorney for the landlords suing Mayor Mamdani. Welcome to you, sir. Good to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
So what's the case the landlords are making?
Well, it's a simple proposition. An independent board, statutorily required to weigh all the evidence and fairly consider the data, instead perverted the process at the mayor's behest to deliver on his campaign promise. This was a sham process to deliver a predetermined outcome that the mayor directed by fiat. That is blatantly illegal, and the ramifications of it are profound. More than 1 million New Yorkers live in rent-stabilized apartments. That's thousands of landlords, many of them struggling to survive because we are living in a period of inflation rising, the costs of landlords soaring, taxes, utilities, insurance. Yet somehow this board, under the mayor's influence, came to the conclusion that 0 rent increase was warranted, not supported by the data. Board did not properly consider the statutory criteria, and we believe it will be found to be illegal. And don't just take my word for it. A longtime board member quit the morning of the vote because she refused to be part of a sham process where she said the outcome was dictated first and then the data manipulated to reach that result. When have you ever heard of a government official resigning on the day of a vote and then in such stark terms calling out the illegality? It's remarkable. It's unprecedented. That's why this case cries out for relief.
But Randy, you know, New York City's own DSA co-chair was joined to Martha McCallum last week. He made the case that New York City landlords are just getting fat off the backs of rent payers. Take a listen to their interaction.
Landlords in New York have been making a 12% return on their investment on average.
How much should they make? What's fair for the landlord to make if you don't like 12?
They're complaining that 12 is not enough. And we don't think that anyone should have a constitutional right to double-digit returns on their investment. That's why we've implemented...
No one should have a right to a double-digit return on their investment.
No one has a right. That's not... No,
what are you talking about?
No one's in that... That's not in the Constitution.
Oh, dear.
Wow. These are the people who they want you to put them in charge, ladies and gentlemen. This guy, people like this guy, they're saying, hey, if you just put us in charge, we'll make things better. We'll make your life better. We'll make things so much more fair. And this is I mean, really, this is insane when you listen to people like this talk. And the reality that their logic is, well, he's not entitled, someone who owns property, someone else should get to dictate how much they're able to make off that property. That's pretty much what he's saying. You bought something, you built it up, you invested in it, you put the time, the energy, the sweat, all that equity into it, but then you should have him. He wants to come along and tell you know what? You can't make 12%. I mean, and mind you, that's not even what's happening in this case. But, he'll let you know how much you can make. Unbelievable. But let's continue.
Okay. Well, insanity. The fact of the matter is we're talking here about a particular group of landlords who have rent-stabilized apartments. Those apartments are not making huge profits. Many of those landlords are underwater. In the Bronx, all of the rent-stabilized apartment owners, they lost money last year. That's the board's own data. This is apocryphal to say that landlords of rent-stabilized apartments are living large. They are barely surviving, so many of them. Yet this board didn't take into account their rising costs and their declining income. In fact, the board manipulated its own data to intentionally understate the costs for landlords and to overstate the income of landlords. And let me explain just briefly how that happened. Utilities going up. The board said, oh no, we predict they will go down next year. July 1, the Mamdani administration raised water utility rates 6%. And on income, they didn't calculate the income of landlords on rent-stabilized apartments. If a landlord had one rent-stabilized unit in a building and the rest were market rate, the board credited any income on any of those apartments, even the ones that are market rate. That is just sophistry. That is not a real assessment of how poorly landlords are doing in these difficult times. And to give those landlords no rent increase whatsoever for 2 years, landlords who are hurting throughout our city, that's just unconscionable.
So you're going to win?
Bring it on.
Okay.
We've got to win because this, for the sake of our local democracy, a mayor cannot abuse his power in this way and take an independent board and make it his puppet. And for the sake of our city, where there has to be fair and balanced policy, the law has to be followed, and struggling landlords have to be recognized as needing some increase, we have to win.
Wow, ladies and gentlemen, that's absolutely insane. So understand what he's saying right there. He's saying they're taking market rate apartments that aren't rent stabilized, and they're basically saying we're going to combine whatever you were able to make from those apartments with the rent stabilized apartments, even though those apartments are far less profitable. Now, I know what you may be saying. Well, why not just maybe higher the rent on the market rate apartments? That way you can make up the loss on the rent stabilized apartments. Don't work like that. That's why it's called market rate apartments. You're competing with the market. You go too high because you're trying to make up your cost in other places with other apartments, such as the rent stabilized ones. Guess what? Tenants, people looking for places to stay, they look elsewhere because they can go on the market and realize that they can go somewhere else and pay a few $100s less. And so it's not as easy, we'll just raise the rent to make up the cost for these rent stabilized apartments that we're losing money on. It don't work like that as easy as people think. Not to mention you still got to deal with insurance, property taxes, utilities, repairs, costs, all these costs that go into it. But now let's go ahead and get into this next part, because then they started to speak to the actual property owners, the landlords, the people who Mamdani is having an effect on negatively with this rent freeze. And it's real easy to paint someone as a villain when you don't know what they're going through. It's really easy. It's easy to say, well, they own properties, they must be doing good in life. They own an entire building, they must be rolling in the dough. That's not the case, ladies and gentlemen. That could be further from the truth if you understand anything when it comes to owning properties, owning a building that you have tenants. If you live in that world, if you know people who are part of that world, then you understand that you're not necessarily making money hand over fist, or you just this rich millionaire automatically, and life is just on easy street. That's not how it works, especially for a lot of people when you just maybe have a property or two or three or whatever in a place like New York City with high property taxes, high cost insurance, the maintaining of these properties that are old buildings in a lot of these cases, and so they need a lot of maintenance, a lot of repairs to keep them going. And so let's go to Fox News, where they interview and they talk to two property owners about that exactly. And Mamdani's trying to paint these people as just and they can afford it. They can afford to freeze the rent and eat the cost, and that can be further from the truth in a lot of these cases. Check this out.
Well, Democratic Socialists taking aim at New York City landlords and their profits. Martha McCallum pressed the co-chair of the DSA's New York chapter about the attacks. Here it is.
Landlords in New York have been making a 12% return on their investment on average.
How much should they make? What's fair for
them out of business?
Well, I heard that and said I want to talk to some landlords. So let's bring in Jose Tour and Natalia Bonanno.
When we implement a rent-free
return on their investment?
That's not in the Constitution, but
let's bring in Jose Tour and talk to some landlords. So let's bring in. I want to talk to. Well, I heard that and said I want to talk to some landlords. So let's bring in Jose Tour and Natalia Bonanno, New York City landlords, and it's so good to have you here. Let me just kick it over to you, Natalia, because when you saw that and heard that, what was your first thought?
I mean, I don't know where they're getting 12% from. I know, a lot of people refer to the NOI figure that came out recently, and
what's NOI?
Net operating income.
Okay.
That doesn't take into account our mortgage and insurance. Our
so he's just getting it wrong on the number. We have a number here that said the average profit for New York City landlords in rent stabilized units is $688 per month. And that's up 6.2% from 23 to 24. That doesn't include your costs, right, Jose?
No, not at all. And he's not speaking for rent-stabilized properties, which is the properties that we own, which are severely distressed because our costs are so high and rents typically are way below the average of the market rents.
And when you say they're distressed, Natalia, does that mean you have to do a lot of repairs?
Yes, and rent-stabilized apartments that are rent-stabilized because they're built before 1974 have a much lower increase and much lower rents, and they typically need the most work. Most of our buildings were built at the turn of the century, early 1900s.
They seem to want to villainize you, and you are the ones providing the housing. But you have a long history of being here. I think that they don't understand who the landlords are. Like, they think that it's like the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah.
Tell me about your story.
Yeah, so it all started with my grandfather. He immigrated from Cuba in the 70s, bought his first building when he was 50 years old in 1979 with seller financing, because at that time the banks wouldn't want to finance. Things were very tough here in the city. The Bronx was burning, as they would say. And he built the business by himself over the course of 10, 15 years, working as much as he can until he got enough money to pay off the buildings and find a helper. And sadly for him, it ended last year where he was mugged at gunpoint by a tenant and had a stroke and died 2 weeks later at 99 years old. I mean, here you have this Cuban immigrant that got to this country, worked as hard as he could, at 50 years old up till 99, and it's how it ended for him. And it was a tenant that didn't pay rent for 5 years. It shows how flawed the system is in its entirety and how inefficient everything is here.
It's a tragic story. And yours is?
Yeah, my father came here as an immigrant as well. When he was a teenager, was the first college graduate of his family, got a master's in engineering, and after a few years working as an engineer, he wanted to, become an entrepreneur and own his own business and own property. So he started to invest also in the 70s and buying properties in Brooklyn, and then pass them down to my sister and I.
Do you want to continue doing this work?
I do. I think it's the right thing to do on behalf of my family and what my grandfather built. And also on behalf of the tenants. These are people that we've known for several years. It's not like we're a huge company that's not present. Like, we're boots on the ground, we're there, we know everyone there, and we think it's the right thing to do to represent our stake.
Last word to you, Natalia. Natalia, excuse me.
That's okay. Yeah, we're selling most of our rent-stabilized buildings because we just don't see a future here for having profit. We hope we could stay in New York City and maybe invest in non-rent stabilized properties, but if not, we'll have to just sell and purchase properties in other states.
Well, we'll see if they're listening at the mayor's office. Thank you so much, and we appreciate. And I'm sorry about what happened.
And that's the part right there that Mamdani wants to sweep under the rug that landlords, property owners have to deal with. Tenants not paying their rent. You're still responsible for the mortgage, though. And so, you know, Mamdani has done a good job of deceiving people and making them believe that the landlords, they're just evil, they're rich, they have all this money, and it's the tenants who are the ones who are struggling, who are suffering, and they deserve the break. Now, I'm not saying that every landlord, every property owner is out here doing the right thing. But what I'm saying is Mamdani is creating a caricature of what he wants everyone to believe. And it worked, because that's why he was able to get his people onto that board, and then they passed it. And now you have the rent freeze happening in New York City, unless they're able to get it overturned with this lawsuit. But when you have things like this happening, ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to this article really quick. Mamdani faces lawsuit over unlawful New York City rent freeze as landlords rip abuse of power. And so just take a look at this. You're dealing with where you have one landlord, one property owner claimed $90,000 in unpaid rent at a Bronx building. And so it says one property owner claimed $90,000, $90K in unpaid rent at a Bronx building, ladies and gentlemen. Another landlord whose family has owned and self-managed their Queens building since 1974 was owed $70K in rent, with over $25K owed by a single tenant. And so that's part of what you have to deal with when you own property, and dealing with tenants who are not paying their rent, and then the need to go through the legal process, which it's not like that's just going to be a quick fix where that's just going to solve your problem right away. No, that takes time also. And during all that time, the person is still living there while you're trying to take them through the legal process, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, just take a listen to this. Evicting a tenant in New York City is notoriously difficult, heavily regulated, and time-consuming. Landlords are legally prohibited from self-help evictions, like changing locks. They must secure a court order. Due to housing court backlogs, the entire process can take anywhere from 12 to 24 months. And so you're dealing with somebody who they're not paying rent, and now you got to deal with them for 12 to 24 months where they're back on rent, they're not paying rent, whatever it is, they're not holding up their end of the contract. And you are still, as the owner, responsible for the mortgage, responsible for the property taxes, responsible for the upkeep, the cost, all of the above. And that's just one unit. Now imagine if you got to deal with that with multiple people. But let's go ahead and jump into this next clip, because these are the type of people who he's looking to support. Let's take a look at this. Mamdani faces online backlash after a press conference where a housing advocate called evictions a form of violence, and the mayor appeared supportive. And so take a look at this.
The Mamdani administration is emboldening us so that we no longer tolerate the violence of evictions as a matter of business as usual. My landlord owns dozens of buildings, but he is not a steward of the public trust. In fact, it is the opposite. Since 2005, I survived 3 faulty eviction cases. I've lost 3 friends to eviction, 2 of whom lived on my floor. And for the past year and a half, our supportive housing neighbors have been dissuaded from joining our fledgling tenant union. But today's report shows there is a path forward.
I mean, I'd like to know, how is it you found yourself 3 different occasions up for eviction? That's what I want to know. I've lived in apartments most of my life. Now I don't. Now I'm fortunate enough to have my own home, but I lived in apartments all that time before then. I was a renter. Never had any eviction problems, because it's very simple. You pay your rent and you can stay. You don't like how much rent costs, you find somewhere else to live. It's not a hard concept. It's really not. I've had to do it several times. You move on. You find what you can afford, you budget correctly, and that's the way life goes. I like to know why you had to deal with evictions on 3 different occasions, and you seem to run in packs with friends who also get evicted. You sound like a bunch of people who don't want to actually pay for anything. I'm just saying. Want to find out ways to try to manipulate and get over on the system. Just my thoughts. I don't know. But you guys let me know your thoughts on this topic. Drop your comments down below. I appreciate when you guys chime in. Don't forget you enjoy the content. Smash that thumbs up. For more, subscribe to the channel. And as always, until next time.